Part 1. The events of the past several days have both shaken my understanding of the world and left me with a disheartened and perplexed disposition. Yet I feel that I must organize these events in my mind, that I am compelled to structure the terrible things which I have seen so that I may understand them better, so that my mind may be at rest. A need to quantify just what took place. It was entirely by accident that I met one John R. It was spring, and the early crocuses were faring well against the last frozen constraints of winter's grip. I was researching an article I was writing for a publication which was, shall we say, less than reputable, when I found myself at the mercy of a small Highland village for the evening. The whole ordeal was frustrating and tiresome, to say the least. I was supposed to be back in Glasgow that night to type up my notes and brush off the fog which often accompanied my writing assignments. Being stranded in a tiny village with one street and a pub inn, which looked like it hadn't been decorated since the Dark Ages, was not my idea of home comfort. Especially after a few weeks of constant travel, interminable interviewees, and more than one restless night in a dingy bed and breakfast. There had been a small subsidence one town over which had made it impossible for the local bus to continue onward and, more importantly to me, carry me to safety. Following several phone calls as I attempted to procure alternative travel arrangements, it became apparent that I was going nowhere until morning. The sleepy pub inn, which was affectionately entitled the Laird of Dungorth, looking like it could fall down on top of me at any moment, complete as it was with warped wooden rafters and a clientele who appeared just as creaky, would have to be my home for the night. After speaking to the owner, a tall, peaked man in his 50s, I was kindly given a small room upstairs which clearly hadn't been slept in or cleaned for some time. Still, the people were nice enough, and after some basic but enjoyable local food, I sat in a cozy armchair by an old open fire in the bar, deciding to kill the boredom with a few pints of local beer and a bottle of wine. The flames danced around before me, and as the evening drew in and the numbing of alcohol took effect, I actually was quite content, almost glad to be in such rustic surroundings. The village may have been somewhat bleak, but against the cold winds outside and a darkening sky, the inn was not without charm. I'm not sure how long he had been sitting there, hypnotized as I was by the heat from under the mantelpiece and a few glasses of red, but it became apparent that I had been joined by another guest at the inn. He sat across from me in a broad and frayed armchair on the other side of the fireplace, sat there gazing at the flickering flames. He was curious in disposition. Outwardly he appeared to be relatively young, probably in his early 30s, but his persona was swamped in a fragility which one would normally not expect to see in a man of his age. His face glowed in the firelight, carrying with it worry and lines which betrayed an inner turmoil. His eyes defocused, glazed over, and his hands trembling slightly as he warmed them by the burning embers. "Is there a problem?" I heard the words, but did not register them until they were repeated. "Excuse me, is there a problem?" The man addressed me in a sharp manner, and I was taken aback by the realization that I had been staring at him for several minutes. "No, not at all," I answered apologetically. I thought I recognized you." As he turned to face me, he displayed in his expression a look of disbelief at my obvious lie, but thankfully, not without a small vestige of good humor. "I apologize if I was a little abrupt with you," he said. "It's just that I am sick and tired of people staring at me around here." He raised his voice at the conclusion of his sentence and cast a wide eye around the pub to the few scattered drinkers and lurkers who populated it. I sensed that those present wished to avoid his gaze. We then diverted into an hour or so of small talk. His name was John R., and he was a land acquirement agent from London. He claimed to be appraising a location nearby, which a local farmer was willing to sell off to property developers. But I immediately sensed that he was not comfortable talking about his work. In fact, he quickly changed the focus of the conversation onto me entirely. My job, life, family, anything. It was as if he needed our exchanges to continue in an obviously failed attempt to keep his mind distracted from a hidden anxiety. Each time I attempted to ask a question about him or his life, he would either provide one or two-word answers or ignore them altogether, moving quickly into a question of his own. Finally, the conversation ran its course, as they often do with only one real participant, and for a moment we sat in relative silence, the only sounds coming from a few locals propping up the bar and the occasional clink of empty glasses being washed and cleaned by the owner. The pub was now noticeably dimmer, with most of the light being provided by a few small overhead lights and the fire which continued to crackle and flicker all evening. I turned to one of the windows outside, seeing nothing but darkness. Then the words just escaped from my mouth without a thought or effort. "Why would people be staring at you, John?" There was a long pause as I looked at him while awaiting an answer, his eyes trained to the floor, but his face etched in worry. I expected no in-depth response, given the curtness of his previous conversation, and so continued drinking my wine when he suddenly replied in a somber tone. "They all know, but they don't have the courage to speak about it." Turning to the few fellow drinkers still in the pub, he then shouted, "They're all afraid." The response from the landlord and his patrons was unusually muted. They seemed to ignore John's accusation entirely, with only the briefest hesitation of movement or conversation proof that they had actually heard the outburst at all. I did not expect such a volatile response, but there was desperation in that shout, anger and frustration. Then, looking directly at me with what I can only describe as a mixture of fear and heartbreak, he opened his mouth as if to speak again, before hesitating once more. I sensed that the man deep down wished to finally relieve himself of a burden, as if some piece of toxic information was boring into his very soul. As a writer, my curiosity was captivated by the possibility of an enthralling tale, perhaps even one I could use as the basis for a future article or story. Anticipating that he now only required the slightest push to confide in me, I leaned over and whispered, "What is it?" filled with conflicting sentiment. I could feel that I was about to become privy to something important, yet by his trembling and anxious demeanor I dreaded what that something might be. Another moment passed, and it was as if the entire room had fallen under a shadow of palpable silence, those nearby listening from tenebrous and uninviting corners. Then he spoke. "If you'd be kind enough to share your wine with me, I'd be glad to tell you," he said softly. He did not have to say twice. I rose out of my chair and asked at the bar for a second bottle and glass to share with my companion. There was a peculiar hesitancy as the landlord picked up both from the shelf behind him, placing them in front of me. As I returned to my seat, I knew those present were now watching me, and I felt in my bones that there was something uncomfortably stifling about their looks, shadowed accusatory glances steeped in fear. I poured a glass of wine, of which John drank in one glutinous gulp, a sight I knew well, as of a man drowning a malignancy which burns inside. After pouring him another, I sat the bottle between us waiting for him to tell his story. After looking down at his drink for a moment, he raised his head, staring intently at me as the fire crackled and burned. Then, as if exorcising a burden from his soul, he began. John had initially intended on spending no more than a few days in the village, even after traveling all day from London, and the evening bringing with it the bite of the Scottish winter. He intended to get started as quickly as possible. The quicker he was finished, the quicker he'd be home. Working for a large property acquisition firm, it was his job to facilitate rich clients in their pursuit of land on which to build on. The individual he was representing at that time was especially interested in buying some farmland with a beautiful country view, where they wished to build a large holiday home for their family. The location in question had recently been put on the market by a local farmer who had fallen on difficult times as the economy wilted. John was, therefore, hired to evaluate the land and negotiate a price, based on the recommendations made by a group of surveyors who had been there the previous week. After checking into the Laird of Dungorth, he drove his car to the farm, which was only a few miles outside of the village. The entire area consisted of large sprawling fields where crops were grown and animals grazed, a few patches of woodland, and the occasional river or bubbling stream. The negotiations were relatively simple. The farmer, an elderly man by the name of Dale, needed an injection of money as soon as possible to keep the rest of the farm on its feet, while the buying client was enthusiastic about the potential purchase and wished to conclude the deal quickly. Regardless, John was always careful about finalizing a deal before he himself had taken a look at the land. Over the years, he had developed a reputation for delivering exactly what a client wanted, without any nasty surprises after procurement such as land subsidences or other planning difficulties. Although he didn't much enjoy the groundwork of surveying, he was well qualified to spot anything which might cause difficulties at a later date. But despite this thorough attitude, he still hoped to be back in the city, perhaps as soon as the next day. All things being well, the farmer, Mr. Dale, graciously agreed to take him out to the land by tractor, and it was not without a slight feeling of remorse that John listened to the old man describing the history of the area, his family's attachment to it, and why it was so important for him to keep the place going. But business was business, and the money Dale would make on the 2 fields in question would provide him with a substantial windfall, hopefully enough to help him weather the financial storm. Night approached quickly, and John was delighted that the bumpy and uncomfortable drive did not take too long. After a short time, Dale stopped the tractor, pointing to the 2 adjacent fields he was selling. For the next half hour, John sloshed through the mud and grass in his boots, taking photographs of where his clients were thinking of building, while perusing the surveyor team's notes, comparing them with his own observations. Dale did not wish to accompany him in the survey, and so stood by the side of a graveled path, watching forlornly. Finally, John had finished, but just as he did so, his eyes were drawn to a hill a few miles away, one which looked out over the entire area. It appeared to be uninhabited, with what looked like patches of woodland and grassland being its only distinguishing features. Despite its distance, the hill seemed to dominate the horizon, and without verbalizing it, he felt as though it was special or unique somehow. On returning to the tractor, he pointed to it, but Dale seemed unwilling to talk about that particular subject, answering any questions pertaining to it with an icy silence. It was John's job to keep a portfolio of land which he thought clients might have been interested in, and with what to him looked like a beautiful view of the countryside, it would be something worth appraising for development, especially for a rich business person in love with the Scottish Highlands. On the short journey back to the farm, John felt compelled to continually glance over his shoulder at the hill and was convinced that his professional instincts were telling him to investigate it more closely. After some annoying persistence, Farmer Dale eventually surrendered his silence and spoke briefly on the subject, with obvious disdain for the unusual landmark. When asked who owned it, even if perhaps Dale himself was the landlord, but at the mere mention of this, the farmer scoffed, saying only, "No one owns that place, and no one goes there neither." He would not say much else, but before John departed for the inn, the farmer placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and advising him to leave the hill alone, that it was dangerous, and that he hoped he would never have to speak of it again. While Dale seemed to fear any mention of it, the overriding impression conveyed was that the old man was dominated by a profound sadness, one which was best left alone. As much as he was fascinated by the farmer's warnings, it was not the first time that John had encountered local superstitions, ones which he of course never listened to, otherwise he might have lost out on a few good pieces of land or property throughout the years. The stories locals would entertain him with always seemed to revolve around older, more remote parts of Britain. In the past, he had been told tall tales about abandoned houses which carried with them the stain of some murderous deed, or woods which should not be cut down for fear of what lived in them. But without exception, nothing untoward had ever happened. There was no solidity to the myths, and while he enjoyed listening to accounts of hauntings and strange beings which prowled the moors and open countryside, he had little time for them in his line of work. Such stories were a fun distraction, but beyond entertainment around a campfire, they served little purpose. Returning to the inn, he was tired and keen to get to bed, hoping to conclude any business the following day. But before he retired to his room, he decided to have a small nightcap at the bar. The landlord seemed amiable enough, and happy to have someone staying there as the inn's location often left it quite empty. But his friendly demeanor altered drastically at the mention of the hill. Much like Dale, the landlord seemed reluctant to give any detailed information about it, and provided his own words of warning, citing bad ground as reason enough to let it be. Whispers and subtle dissension came from the darkened corners of the room, as locals seemed perturbed by John's questions. No one approached him, but he was well aware of their discomfort. His remark of, "You'd think the hill was haunted," which was intended as a joke, provoked only silence. The void of sound left John feeling unwelcome. Quickly he finished his drink and walked towards the stairs to his room. But as he did so, a young woman barely out of her teens gently touched him on the shoulder and whispered into his ear, "Please don't go to the hill. No one ever comes back." The landlord was within earshot and quickly chastised the girl for even mentioning it, then turned his back while cleaning a pint glass, saying in a stuttered tone, "You sleep well, sir. I hope you can conclude your business tomorrow and get back down to London quickly." To John, it sounded more like a warning than a simple good night. The next day, he rose early and made his way downstairs to be greeted once more by the landlord, but the man remained relatively quiet, which John found odd, since he had seemed to be quite a talkative fellow when he had first arrived. Dismissing his host as just another individual averse to mornings, John grabbed a light breakfast and then made his way back out to the farm to conclude the purchase of Dale's land. As he drove along the quiet country roads, appreciating the impressive landscape even in overcast weather, the farm came into view, but in the distance, so too did the hill. He thought that it seemed a little more prevalent or imposing than the day before, with its crooked structure leaning towards the village in the distance, but quickly shook those feelings from his mind, regarding them as the after-effects of the townsfolk and their superstitious behavior. And yet, there was something about that place. With only a few administrative duties left to perform, John was hopeful that he could be finished by noon and then make the long-hour drive back to London, finishing up some loose ends before taking part in his usual routine. On a desk in his apartment sat a year-old bottle of Balvenie malt whiskey, which he would pour a glass from after completing an important deal. This would be accompanied by a cigarette or two, the only time he smoked, as he couldn't trust himself to not succumb to the habit. A takeaway meal, and the next day off from work to do as he pleased. These were the times he enjoyed the most, the conclusion of a deal and a little break before, once again, being sent to another remote corner of the British Isles. Sitting in Farmer Dale's cottage, John enjoyed the coziness of the place and its antiquated decorations, which reminded him of his grandmother's house as a child. Many of the facings were original, and he was certain that much of the house must have stemmed back countless generations. Dale himself seemed in a more pleasant mood than the day before, making his guest a cup of tea and a sandwich, while John prepared the last of the paperwork. As the old farmer pottered around with a kettle and a pair of cups in hand, John glanced through a nearby window, noticing that the house itself looked out towards the nameless hill a few miles away. Without thinking, he mentioned casually that those at the inn seemed wary of it too. On giving John his tea, Dale sat down at the opposite end of the kitchen table, stirring his cup thoughtfully. There was another silence, similar to that of the evening before, and despite the cozy surroundings, John once again felt uncomfortable. Then eventually, that unsettling feeling gave way to annoyance. Why should he not simply ask why people were so afraid of it? These were just superstitions, and it was madness to think that in the modern age, people could still be swayed so easily by simple stories. After toying with the idea of remaining quiet, John finally broke the silence. "Mr. Dale, I don't mean to be rude, but ever since I arrived in the village, people seem to be acting strangely about that hill, and they treat me like I've committed a crime just by mentioning it." "Perhaps you did," he replied. "Perhaps you shouldn't have mentioned it at all, son. With all due respect, I just wanted to know who owned it, as I thought it could be good for the area, an exciting property development." "Property development," Mr. Dale scoffed. "The only thing that should be done with that place is that the ground be sowed with salt. It's just a hill, the old farmer trailed off for a moment, looking out of the window towards the uncomfortable subject of their discussion. "Mr. Dale," John said, this time more softly, "I've been to many scenic locations around the UK. I know that some areas have stories, they get a bad name, or just seem a little frightening. But in my experience, I have never come across any of them that couldn't be put down to simple superstition. Or I'll even prove it." "Prove what, lad?" said Mr. Dale, suddenly apprehensive. "I fancy a stroll before I head back to London. I think I'll take a look." Standing up abruptly, the farmer appeared now more anxious than angry. His upper lip quivered, and he had the appearance of a man who had been hiding a destructive amount of stress from the outside world, just waiting to be vented. "You mustn't go there," he shouted. "Please, Mr. Dale, I didn't mean to offend you." John's thoughts now turned back to the deal at hand, and with nothing signed yet he did not wish to jeopardize it with his curiosity. How would he explain that to his client? The old man slumped back down into his seat as his eyes glazed over, as if fighting a losing battle against an onslaught of terrible memories. "I lost my son to that place," he said, trailing off. "Oh God, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Dale. Please accept my apologies. Let's just forget the whole thing." "No, it's not your fault." The old farmer smiled across the table with a sorrowful countenance. "No one talks about my boy. I'm not allowed to. The locals think that just speaking about him and the others will somehow bring more misery down to the village." After a brief pause of contemplation, he broke down, saying, "He was a good lad. We're not built to lose our children. Oh, God." Burying his head in his hands, he began sobbing uncontrollably. John did not know what to say. He could only offer, "I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" Wiping the tears from his eyes, Dale sat back in his chair mournfully. After a few deep breaths, he composed himself and then spoke, his voice quivering with held-back emotion. "No one knows when it started, and no one knows why." "What started?" asked John, his compassion now overpowered by his curiosity. "I grew up in this village, and even when I was a boy, people didn't have a clue." Sure, they talked about old stories, about a dispute between two powerful families which went back hundreds of years. Dale leaned forward, scratching the graying stubble on his chin before continuing. But no one knew their names, at least no one who was willing to talk about the hill. The deeds to that land are probably sitting in some solicitor's safe with the owner living the high life somewhere, unaware of the price we've all paid. Surely there must be a record of the owners. I'm sure there is, lad, but you won't find anyone around here who wants to know. Over the years, the odd person would ignore the warnings and venture up there, normally kids daring one another to have a go, but they never come back. Dale shuffled in his seat uncomfortably as tears began to fill his eyes once more. My boy. He didn't listen, and just like the others, he went up, and then he was gone. Surely you went after him? Asked John in disbelief. Yes, I did. I tried to go up there, but as broken by grief as my wife and other children were, they pulled me back from the foot of the hill. They knew it would take me too. So your own son could have been up there, hurt, dying, and you didn't go after him all because of a stupid superstition? The idea that myths and lies could have resulted in a young boy's death enraged John, yet he felt ashamed of himself as soon as the words left his mouth. Dale suddenly flew across the table, grabbing his now unwelcome guest by the collar, battering him against an old stove. Who do you think you're talking to? Dale screamed, his voice shaking John to his core. For an old man, he was still as strong as an ox. For a brief moment he thought that the farmer was going to hit him, but then, just as quickly, Dale relinquished his grip, turning his back. When you have 3 other children to feed, and a wife who would be heartbroken, you'd think twice about going up there too. Besides, a few of the boys from the village helped my wife, and well, no one would let me go. Not because they cared about me, well, maybe some did, but mainly because they live in constant fear of that place, of what's up there, that it might come down and pay us all a visit. Straightening a chair, the old farmer scribbled his signature on the remaining papers and then asked John to leave, which he did after offering his apologies once more. At the door, both men gave their polite goodbyes with Dale, simply adding, "There's an old saying around here, best leave alone, you'd be wise to listen to it." Despite being shaken by the old farmer's volatile reaction to his inquiries, John was still certain that he wanted to visit the hill, knowing that those in the village would try to dissuade or even physically restrain him from doing so. He was resolute in driving there immediately from the farm. As he got underway, he thought that perhaps some good could come of it. He could break their fear of that place, but it was more so his stubbornness which now motivated him. He wanted to prove he was right, and if he discovered a piece of land perfect for development in the process, all the better. Getting there was more troublesome than he had first anticipated. While there was a small country road which led to the foot of the hill, it had been apparently blocked off by the villagers. An arrangement of large concrete slabs, red bricks, old wooden posts, and other discarded materials had been unceremoniously dumped at either end of the road, making entrance by car an impossibility and by foot only with great difficulty. Seeing the very real and physical lengths which the locals would go to in order to stop anyone from accessing the hill, John felt an increasing impulse to reach its peak and then return to the village to let those below know how ridiculous they had been. After leaving his car by one of the blocked entrances, he climbed over the stack of rubble with some effort, careful not to cut himself on anything which protruded, and then made his way along the road. For a moment he considered what he might find on the hillside and the very real possibility of discovering the grim remains of a previous visitor, thoughts which momentarily left him questioning his current course of action. The road was just wide enough for a single car, and it had obviously been left to the elements for some time, with large potholes scarring its surface and deposits of mud and gravel covering the tarmac in places. As the hill came into view, he was struck by how much larger it appeared to be than he had estimated. From distance, he would have assumed a quick hike to its peak, but looking at its incline arching away from him, he realized that it would probably take around 2 hours to reach its crest, and that was only if a track, or at least good footing, could be found. Looking at his watch, it was early afternoon, but he believed he'd still have enough daylight to make it to the top and then back to his car safely. It was there that he began to notice some of the strange landmark's more peculiar features. It stood quite alone, with no accompanying hills around it, as if it had been left there in isolation, quarantined from the land itself. Its ascent seemed more pronouncedly crooked than it had at distance, asymmetrical, leaning slightly to one side in bizarre fashion, and its surface was covered in sporadic pockets of trees, while wild and untamed collections of long grasses, a tangle of dead yellow strands embraced or strangled by the green shoots of more successful strains invading all around. Most surprising of all was that there was a man-made path which ran up towards the peak, one which he was delighted to discover. It had been spared the onslaught of the wiry and spindly grass which had consumed everything else. For a moment, John considered that this was all a hoax and that he was the victim of an elaborate joke, as the path looked well worn as though often used. But then a much darker thought flirted with his rational sensibilities, that the hill itself was leaning inward, enticing visitors, welcoming them to an unknown destination. He quickly dismissed this notion and continued on. An old gate blocked the way. It was wooden, but had obviously been subjected to the ravages of the Scottish weather for some time, as its surface was partially eaten away by green moss and mold. As it creaked open, John stepped over the threshold, and as the gate closed behind him, a shiver ran up his spine, accompanied by a mild nauseous feeling in his throat. If he had been superstitious himself, he would have said that the place was bad, that the air seemed foul, but he was not easily affected by such thoughts. It was more likely that something he had eaten had not agreed with him, rather than the hill itself acting upon his nerves. Wandering up the path, he attempted to make as good time as possible. The idea of making his way back down at night was not one to be relished, with unsure and unseen footing, and as the afternoon sky was already a little dimmer than it had been at noon, he marched up the hill with intent, excited to take in the view from the top. The incline increased slightly, and with it so did the sporadic nature of his surroundings. The long grass had claimed everything bar the path, and as clumps of trees occasionally flanked him, he could now appreciate why the locals had come to fear such a place, the reeds of dead grass and ivy encircling each trunk suggesting malevolent purpose. Some of the trees had even fallen over, taking unusual positions at steep angles, appearing as if they had been pulled into the earth, broken by the fingers of grass which had clung to the husks of wood like a very real leviathan. But while the idea was fanciful, somehow the hillside did indeed feel wrong, unnatural in places, and as John ascended it, a coldness began to creep up his arms. He had hiked before, and in his job had often been required to brave the wilderness while evaluating land, but this felt different. It was as if the land was affecting the temperature, rather than the weather, making it increasingly difficult to ignore the oppressive atmosphere of the hill. Stopping for a moment, he rubbed his arms hastily to warm them, pausing to appraise his progress. He was astonished by how far he had actually climbed. He had been walking for no more than 20 minutes, but looking in the direction he had come from, he must have been at least halfway up the hillside, but how could he be? At every evaluation of the hill's size, it seemed to confound the previous conclusion. It was as if the place was warped somehow. John laughed to himself at being so swept up in the impression of his surroundings, yet the silence bothered him. No birds, no rustling bushes filled with rabbits, foxes, or even insects. Indeed, the entire hillside felt dead. No, not dead, he thought, but in the grips of death itself. It was, however, winter, so perhaps he should have expected the seeming sterility of the countryside, but the quiet still perturbed him. Then another unusual phenomenon came to his attention, an inconsistency, something which contradicted his own memory, his very faculties. The path behind was now different. While climbing, John had been amazed by how overgrown the hillside was compared to the track leading upward. This led him to suspect that it was perhaps used regularly, but on looking down the hill, it now appeared to be engulfed by the wandering hands of nature. Perhaps not completely, but certainly to a far greater degree than it had been before. The grass swept over it, while bushes and trees leaned in nearby, suggesting a more rugged terrain than he had initially noticed. Yet the path ahead lay clear. Looking to the world outside and down below, everything appeared distant somehow, almost synthetic in appearance. The colors were not as vivid, the meadows which populated the valleys had forgone their vibrancy, and the sky itself filtered down towards the ground with what John could only describe as false light. He struggled to dismiss the unwelcome feelings he was experiencing, and while he continued on for a time, as he climbed, the nausea from when he had first stepped foot onto the hillside returned. The cold sensation which had enveloped his extremities had progressed like a disease, penetrating his insides and chilling him to the bone. John had tried his best to reach the peak, but he was no fool. He knew that not a month passed without a report on the news about an inexperienced walker or climber going missing on a remote mountain, and while the hill was a seemingly more humble prospect, he was now willing to accept defeat, even welcoming it. The surroundings felt menacing, and his current physical condition was enough to cause retreat. Though he had not reached the summit, John decided that if he still made it back to the village after being on the hillside, that would be enough to dispute their superstitions. Perhaps he would return in the summer to evaluate the land, considering his decision to be a postponement rather than an admission of failure. Entertaining the notion that the locals may have been right all along was not something he wished to do. During my childhood, my family was like a drop of water in a vast river, never remaining in one location for long. We settled in Rhode Island when I was 8, and there we remained until I went to college in Colorado Springs. Most of my memories are rooted in Rhode Island, but there are fragments in the attic of my brain which belong to the various homes we had lived in when I was much younger. Most of these memories are unclear and pointless. Chasing after another boy in the backyard of a house in North Carolina, trying to build a raft to float on the creek behind the apartment we rented in Pennsylvania, and so on. But there is one set of memories which remains as clear as glass, as though they were just made yesterday. I often wonder whether these memories are simply lucid dreams produced by the long sickness I experienced that spring, but in my heart, I know they are real. We were living in a house just outside the bustling metropolis of New Vineyard, Maine, population. It was a large structure, especially for a family of 3. There were a number of rooms that I didn't see in the 5 months we resided there. In some ways it was a waste of space, but it was the only house on the market at the time, at least within an hour's commute to my father's place of work. The day after my 5th birthday, attended by my parents alone, I came down with a fever. The doctor said I had mononucleosis, which meant no rough play and more fever for at least another 3 weeks. It was horrible timing to be bedridden. We were in the process of packing our things to move to Pennsylvania, and most of my things were already packed away in boxes, leaving my room barren. My mother brought me ginger ale and books several times a day, and these served the function of being my primary form of entertainment for the next few weeks. Boredom always loomed just around the corner, waiting to rear its ugly head and compound my misery. I don't exactly recall how I met Mr. Widemouth. I think it was about a week after I was diagnosed with mono. My first memory of the small creature was asking him if he had a name. He told me to call him Mr. Widemouth because his mouth was large. In fact, everything about him was large in comparison to his body, his head, his eyes, his crooked ears. But his mouth was by far the largest. "You look kind of like a Furby," I said as he flipped through one of my books. Mr. Widemouth stopped and gave me a puzzled look. "Furby? What's a Furby?" he asked. I shrugged. "You know, the toy, the little robot with the big ears. You can pet and feed them, almost like a real pet." "Oh." Mr. Widemouth resumed his activity. "You don't need one of those. They aren't the same as having a real friend." I remember Mr. Widemouth disappearing every time my mother stopped by to check in on me. "I lay under your bed," he later explained. "I don't want your parents to see me because I'm afraid they won't let us play anymore." We didn't do much during those first few days. Mr. Widemouth just looked at my books, fascinated by the stories and pictures they contained. The 3rd or 4th morning after I met him, he greeted me with a large smile on his face. "I have a new game we can play," he said. "We have to wait until after your mother comes to check on you, because she can't see us play it. It's a secret game." After my mother delivered more books and soda at the usual time, Mr. Widemouth slipped out from under the bed and tugged my hand. "We have to go the room at the end of this hallway," he said. I objected at first, as my parents had forbidden me to leave my bed without their permission, but Mr. Widemouth persisted until I gave in. The room in question had no furniture or wallpaper. Its only distinguishing feature was a window opposite the doorway. Mr. Widemouth darted across the room and gave the window a firm push, flinging it open. He then beckoned me to look out at the ground below. We were on the 2nd story of the house, but it was on a hill, and from this angle, the drop was farther than 2 stories due to the incline. "I like to play pretend up here," Mr. Widemouth explained. "I pretend that there is a big soft trampoline below this window and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try." I was a 5-year-old with a fever, so only a hint of skepticism darted through my thoughts as I looked down and considered the possibility. "It's a long drop," I said. "But that's all a part of the fun. It wouldn't be fun if it was only a short drop. If it were that way, you may as well just bounce on a real trampoline." I toyed with the idea, picturing myself falling through thin air only to bounce back to the window on something unseen by human eyes. But the realist in me prevailed. "Maybe some other time," I said. "I don't know if I have enough imagination. I could get hurt." Mr. Widemouth's face contorted into a snarl, but only for a moment. Anger gave way to disappointment. "If you say so," he said. He spent the rest of the day under my bed, quiet as a mouse. The following morning, Mr. Widemouth arrived holding a small box. "I want to teach you how to juggle," he said. "Here are some things you can use to practice before I start giving you lessons." I looked in the box. It was full of knives. "My parents will kill me," I shouted, horrified that Mr. Widemouth had brought knives into my room, objects that my parents would never allow me to touch. "I'll be spanked and grounded for a year." Mr. Widemouth frowned. "It's fun to juggle with these. I want you to try it." I pushed the box away. "I can't. I'll get in trouble. Knives aren't safe to just throw in the air." Mr. Widemouth's frown deepened into a scowl. He took the box of knives and slid under my bed, remaining there the rest of the day. I began to wonder how often he was under me. I started having trouble sleeping after that. Mr. Widemouth often woke me up at night, saying he put a real trampoline under the window, a big one that I couldn't see in the dark. I always declined and tried to go back to sleep, but Mr. Widemouth persisted. Sometimes he stayed by my side until early in the morning, encouraging me to jump. He wasn't so fun to play with anymore. My mother came to me one morning and told me I had her permission to walk around outside. She thought the fresh air would be good for me, especially after being confined to my room for so long. Ecstatic, I put on my sneakers and trotted out to the back porch, yearning for the feeling of sun on my face. Mr. Widemouth was waiting for me. "I have something I want you to see," he said. I must have given him a weird look because he then said, "It's safe, I promise." I followed him to the beginning of a deer trail which ran through the woods behind the house. "This is an important path," he explained. "I've had a lot of friends about your age. When they were ready, I took them down this path, to a special place. You aren't ready yet, but one day, I hope to take you there." I returned to the house wondering what kind of place lay beyond that trail. 2 weeks after I met Mr. Widemouth, the last load of our things had been packed into a moving truck. I would be in the cab of that truck, sitting next to my father for the long drive to Pennsylvania. I considered telling Mr. Widemouth that I would be leaving, but even at 5 years old, I was beginning to suspect that perhaps the creature's intentions were not to my benefit, despite what he said otherwise. For this reason, I decided to keep my departure a secret. My father and I were in the truck at a.m. He was hoping to make it to Pennsylvania by lunchtime tomorrow, with the help of an endless supply of coffee and a 6-pack of energy drinks. He seemed more like a man who was about to run a marathon, rather than one who was about to spend 2 days sitting still. "Early enough for you?" he asked. I nodded and placed my head against the window, hoping for some sleep before the sun came up. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "This is the last move, son, I promise. I know it's hard for you, as sick as you've been. Once Daddy gets promoted, we can settle down and you can make friends." I opened my eyes as we backed out of the driveway. I saw Mr. Widemouth's silhouette in my bedroom window. He stood motionless until the truck was about to turn onto the main road. He gave a pitiful little wave goodbye, steak knife in hand. I didn't wave back. Years later, I returned to New Vineyard. The piece of land our house stood upon was empty except for the foundation, as the house burned down a few years after my family left. Out of curiosity, I followed the deer trail that Mr. Widemouth had shown me. Part of me expected him to jump out from behind a tree and scare the living bejesus out of me, but I felt that Mr. Widemouth was gone, somehow tied to the house that no longer existed. The trail ended at the New Vineyard Memorial Cemetery. I noticed that many of the tombstones belong to children. Credit, Perfect Circle. 35 more classic creepypasta stories can be found here. The Momo Challenge, the Russia Sleep Experiment, Sonic.exe. Ghost stories? Nah, we don't have anything like that around here. We do have the story of Jacob, but that's about as close as you'll get. You really want to know? Well, I'm not supposed to tell you, but all right, just no interrupting. I don't have the patience for it. How to describe Jacob Emery? Well, I guess you could say he was the kind of guy you could never take notice of. This isn't to say he was a bad kid, in any sense. Many people in this town thought he was the most reliable person for an odd job in the state, but he never really excelled in anything. He was the living proof behind the statement, "Jack of all trades, ace of none." Most of this was due to his own lack of will. He dabbled in damn near everything this town could offer him: automobiles, radio operation, store management, what have you. But he never stuck with anything. His friends and workers went after him about it a number of times, but everybody got the same unsatisfying response: it just wasn't enough. Needless to say, any friends he kept were either very patient or never spoke of the matter altogether. It was probably inevitable then that Jacob would leave to go abroad. I don't remember where he went. But I think Gertrude down the street knew before she passed on. You'll have to scout someone else if you ever get curious. In any case, no one even tried to stop him. Everybody thought that a little travel would stamp the ambition out of him, or else feed it until it was no longer an issue. Hell, we even gave him a sending-off party, which I thought was pretty nice of everybody. So anyway, he was gone for 6-7 years? Can't remember. You'll have to check with someone else about that too. Anyways, he came back, eventually. And he had changed, obviously enough. He was amiable, energetic, all smiles all the time, and we all quickly learned why. He showed us a souvenir he'd brought back, a solid black stick, the length of a pencil but the texture of chalk. We all wondered why on earth such a simple thing would prompt such a spring in his step until he gave his demonstration. He took a piece of paper, and with this stick, God, there's got to be a better word for it. With this stick, he drew a crude circle. It dropped and rested on the border of the paper, like a stone. It didn't leave the paper, but it acted out on it, sort of like an old movie projector on a screen. Son, I know how crazy that sounds, and if you feel like playing skeptic, then you can leave an old man to his craziness, but I know what I saw, even if everyone's been hushing it up, and that stone he drew dropped. Jake even passed around the paper, and as it was being passed, it rolled around as the paper got tilted. None of us had any words for it. Hell, what was there to say? But he continued drawing demonstration after demonstration for us. Stick figures in various pageants and plays, doing everything from fighting each other to making perfect human pyramids, and we all thought it was incredible. That was all the go-ahead he needed. He announced that he planned to put on shows to pay for rent and food, where he would draw anything the crowd members wanted, that we talked to some length about, and he eventually convinced us that it would be safe, his drawings ethical, the practice lucrative and unique, and the attention would not go anywhere outside of the town's borders. Poor Jacob. If I'd not been so swept up in the moment, I might have read the signs right then and there, and saved the sorry son of a bitch by snapping the terrible thing in half. But I was younger, we all were, and we saw no problem with encouraging him with what we all saw as an incredible experience to be shared with everyone else. Now, he didn't have any big radio or television connections, mind you, and the internet wouldn't come around for another decade, so he did what all people on a shoestring budget do. He advertised his show with flyers. Flyers might not mean anything to you city folk, but in a small town, they gain a fair glance over from time to time, and what's more, Jacobs managed to stick out by having little figures jump up and down and whatnot to get people's attention. His first show must have gotten nearly 60 or so people, probably a lot more than that. And his shows were fantastic. Someone would shout out a scene from a play or a comedy sketch, and Jake's hand would fly over a white wall like a bird. He'd been holding back when he made that stone, that's for damn sure. His illustrations were all spot on, and he could make an incredible human figure in minutes. Come to think of it, I don't remember any of his scenes lasting more than 10 minutes to make. They were all really well done scenes, too. Not only could you see a knight charge a castle, Jake would draw the castle's interior as well, like a wedding cake split down the middle so you could see the knight scale the walls, fight his way through levels to the dungeon, fight back out with the princess, and make a leaping jump off castle parapets onto his getaway horse all in complete silence. Not realistic, no, but that was part of the appeal. None of us went in there expecting something real. When a scene or a sketch was finished, either the characters would leave off a wall, or he'd cover the wall with white paint. This was good, in a way. It gave these shows a time limit, so that when he'd finished with all of the 4 walls in the room, everyone knew the show was over until the paint dried. Jake, meanwhile, was changing in a bad way. I'd mentioned that upon his return, he'd been extremely energetic. Well, that energy, that vitality or fervor or whatever you want to call it, it never left him, not for an instant. Far from it, it seemed to grow in him, and he enjoyed it all too much. His eyes grew wider. He slept gradually less over time, his statements and opinions more radical and frenzied, and though he never was a pushover, he was starting to make people nervous in his company. A month or 2 passed, and Jake's audience grew like a wildfire. Nearly everyone in the town paid to see Jake's art in action, and he had to rent out larger and larger places for them to sit. He now didn't stop after one scene was done. He moved directly on to the next, put on the next blank space on the wall, sometimes to the intriguing effect of causing scenes to mingle, which the crowd loved. The subject matter got more wild and immoral. The monsters got more bizarre and creative, the fighters using more impossible weaponry, all for the sake of the crowd's interests. Jake got steadily more indulgent, which we figured was from the money, and he became a drinker, and a womanizer, neither of which got rid of that vitality, by the way. Some of those women claimed that they'd woken up in the middle of the night to see him scribbling with that stick on a drawing pad, a gigantic grin on his face. And while most of them said that they'd assumed he was drawing them in the nude, there's rumors that one or two of them got glances at that notepad. Those anonymous few supposedly said that those drawings absolutely weren't nude pictures, but neither of them, whoever they are, will say what he was drawing. Don't bother looking for the notepads or flyers though, they're all gone now. I'm getting off track. Point is, he was hitting the bottle, and that's important, because it was that drinking that would eventually ruin everything. On the night of one of his performances, as he walked in front of his cheering crowd, it was immediately apparent to everybody that he was completely drunk. I was in the front row, and I could smell the bourbon on him from 10 feet away. The show started, he went through a bunch of sketches and scenarios the crowd recommended, when at the end someone asked that he draw himself. Everyone cheered the idea. I guess they'd been wondering what his creations thought of him, and he eventually obliged. No sooner had Jake finished connecting the final 2 lines on his coat, than every single character, across the vast, expansive wall, all stopped and looked directly at that illustration. Lovers stopped kissing, clowns stopped laughing, robots stopped fighting pirates. Everything stopped and looked at the Jacob illustration. The crowd died almost instantly. I remember Jake's face at that moment, pale white, full of terrible comprehension at his mistake, and looking desperately for the cans of white paint he'd forgotten to put out before the show. Everyone else? They were looking at the fake Jacob. That Jacob reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a black stick of his own, and as we all watched, drew a door. He pushed on his side, and the door swung open, allowing him to walk through onto the floor of the auditorium. The rest was an absolute hellish pandemonium. People screamed and ran for the exits as Jacob's characters, both those currently on the wall and those which had previously left before being covered up, ran out of their own exit, throwing pies, shooting lasers, blowing fire and poison, and the impossible. I was near enough the exit to escape, and gave only one backwards glance. The scene will haunt me forever. Jacob Emery was being dragged by his creations, kicking and screaming, through the door his copy had made. The auditorium burned down, obviously enough, but I have no idea how many characters escaped, what happened to the fake Emery, or how many people died. The fire brought the fire department from the nearest cities up to over 100 miles away. They in turn brought the police force, which brought the government, which hushed up everything. They took the flyers, and any art Jake had made, and swore everyone to secrecy or else life detainment. The fire was blamed on a cigarette in the garbage during a basketball game, and we all eventually went on with our lives. Jacob was made to never have existed. In retrospect, I realize everything. Jacob hadn't been creating illustrations. Illustrations don't move, much less act or attack. They're just images people see, shadows made to look like real things. Jacob had been making life, actual thinking things in some alternate dimension, using a power that was never meant to fall to mortal hands. He got drunk on his power. His punishment was probably well-deserved. Incidentally, the government screwed up on 2 different accounts. They did a damn good job silencing everyone, but proof remains. The ruins are still there, you know. The auditorium's ruins. I hear they're going to start reconstruction soon, which will wipe out any remaining evidence someone can definitely see. But I went back there once, several years after the fire. Just once. Amidst the rubble, covered in ash, I saw something squirming. I looked closer. It was Jacob Emery's hand on the wall, exactly like it had been 3 years ago. Sweaty, but calloused, I remember, but it was constantly flailing, as if the body it was supposed to be attached to was still writhing in flames. That was mistake number 1. Number 2 was those creations. Like I said, I don't know how many escaped, nor how many the government agents found and caught, but I will say only this: those tall grass meadows on the outskirts of town? Don't go into them. Ever. You were asking about those white figures you've seen at night, right? This town doesn't have ghost stories. Credit, Douglas Greenwood, aka Peter Devine. Message begins: we made a mistake. That is the simple, undeniable truth of the matter, however painful it might be. The flaw was not in our observatories, for those machines were as perfect as we could make, and they showed us only the unfiltered light of truth. The flaw was not in the predictor, for it is a device of pure infallible logic, turning raw data into meaningful information without the taint of emotion or bias. No, the flaw was within us, the orchestrators of this disaster, the sentients who thought themselves beyond such failings. We are responsible. It began a short while ago, as these things are measured, less than 6 to the power of 6 daily ago, though I suspect our systems of measure will mean very little by the time anyone receives this transmission. We detected faint radio signals from a blossoming intelligence 2 to the power of 14 dailies outward from the galactic core, as photons travel. At first crude and unstructured, these leaking broadcasts quickly grew in complexity and strength, as did the messages they carried. Through our observatories, we watched a world of strife and violence, populated by a barbaric race of short-lived, fast-breeding vermin. They were brutal and uncultured things, which stabbed and shot and burned each other, with no regard for life or purpose. Even their concepts of art spoke of conflict and pain. They divided themselves according to some bizarre cultural patterns and set their every industry to cause of death. They terrified us, but we were older and wiser and so very far away, so we did not fret. Then we watched them split the atom and breach the heavens within the breadth of one of their single short generations, and we began to worry. When they began actively transmitting messages and greetings into space, we felt fear and horror. Their transmissions promised peace and camaraderie to any who were listening, but we had watched them for too long to buy into such transparent deceptions. They knew we were out here, and they were coming for us. The orchestrators consulted the predictor, and the output was dire. They would multiply and grow and flood out of their home system like some uncountable tide of devourer worms, consuming all that lay in their path. It might take 6 to the power of 8 dailies, but they would destroy us if left unchecked. With aching carapaces, we decided to act and sealed our fate. The gift of mercy was strides long with a mouth, that in diameter, filled with many weights of machinery, fuel, and ballast. It would push itself up to the light speed with its onboard fuel, and then begin to consume interstellar primary element to feed its unlimited acceleration. It would be traveling at nearly light speed when it hit. They would never see it coming. Its launch was a day of mourning, celebration, and reflection. The horror of the act we had committed weighed heavily upon us all. The necessity of our crime did little to comfort us. The gift had barely cleared the outer cometary halo when the mistake was realized, but it was too late. The gift could not be caught, could not be recalled or diverted from its path. The architects and work crews, horrified at the awful power of the thing upon which they labored, had quietly self-terminated in droves, walking unshielded into radiation zones, neglecting proper null-pressure safety, or simple ceasing their nutrient consumption until their metabolic functions stopped. The appalling cost in lives had forced the orchestrators to streamline the gift's design and construction. There had been no time for the design or implementation of anything beyond the simple, massive engines and the stabilizing systems. We could only watch in shame and horror as the light of genocide faded into infrared against the distant void. They grew and they changed. In a handful of lifetimes they abolished war, abandoned their violent tendencies, and turned themselves to the grand purposes of life and art. We watched them remake first themselves, and then their world. Their frail, soft bodies gave way to gleaming metals and plastics. They unified their people through an omnipresent communications grid and produced art of such power and emotion, the likes of which the galaxy has never seen before. Or again, because of us, they converted their home world into a paradise by their standards, and many of them poured out into the surrounding system with a rapidity and vigor that we could only envy. With bodies built to survive every environment from the daylit surface of their innermost world to the atmosphere of their largest gas giant and the cold void in between, they set out to sculpt their system into something beautiful. At first we thought them simple miners, stripping the rocky planets and moons for vital resources, but then we began to see the purpose to their constructions, the artworks carved into every surface, and traced across the system in glittering lights and dancing fusion trails. And still, our terrible gift approached. They had less than daily to see it, following so closely on the tail of its own light. In that time, oh so brief, even by their fleeting lives, more than sentience prepared for death. Lovers exchanged last words, separated by worlds and the tyranny of light speed. Their planetside engineers worked frantically to build sufficient transmission infrastructure to upload the countless masses with the necessary neural modifications, while those above dumped lifetimes of music and literature from their databanks to make room for passengers. Those lacking the required hardware, or the time to acquire it, consigned themselves to death, lashed out in fear and pain, or simply went about their lives as best they could under the circumstances. The gift arrived suddenly, the light of its impact visible in our skies, shining bright and cruel, even to the unaugmented ocular receptor. We watched and we wept for our victims, dead so many dealies before the light of their doom had even reached us, many 6-4 seconds. Of those who had been directly or even tangentially involved in the creation of the gift, sealed their spiracles with paste as a final penance for the small roles they had played in this atrocity. The light dimmed, the dust cleared, and our observatories refocused upon the place where their shining blue world had once hung in the void, and found only dust and the pale gleam of an orphaned moon, wrapped in a thin, burning wisp of atmosphere that had once belonged to its parent. Radiation and relativistic shrapnel had wiped out much of the inner system, and continent-sized chunks of molten rock carried screaming ghosts outward at interstellar escape velocities, damned to wander the great void for an eternity. The damage was apocalyptic, but not complete. From the shadows of the outer worlds, tiny points of light emerged, thousands of fusion trails of single ships and world ships and everything in between. Many 10-6 seconds of survivors in flesh and steel and memory banks, ready to rebuild. For a few moments we felt relief, even joy, and we were filled with the hope that their culture and art would survive the terrible blow we had dealt them. Then came the message, tightly focused at our star, transmitted simultaneously by hundreds of their ships. We know you are out there, and we are coming for you. Message ends. The last storm was already on the horizon when I woke that Sunday morning. It hung in the south, a solid black wall of dust, churning and seemingly motionless. I'd every intention of sleeping late into the morning, as had been my Sunday custom since Adele and the girls had left, but the distant rumbling and crackle of lightning drug me from the bed just after sunrise. I shuffled drowsily around the farm in the early morning, lashing the doors of the barn, rounding up the 2 stubborn hogs and shuttering the windows. But soon I found myself rooted in place, captivated by the writhing shape in the sky. It stretched impossibly wide across the open sky, rolling across the border from Nebraska. The air had a dry, electric chill, and already the sickly yellow wheat swayed in anticipation. I was in a trance, eyes locked on the distance when I saw a small light dust plume to the west, picked out in stark contrast with black beyond. The horse and rider at the base of the little dust devil approached the farm at a sharp trot, and my dust-bleary eyes registered the silhouette. Carl Jordan had owned the farm next to mine, for as long my family has been in the Dakotas, I grew up with his great booming laughter warming our home nearly every night. His usual broad yellowing smile was absent beneath recently trimmed mustache and broad-rimmed black hat. His dark suit was blotted with fine layer of grit that he brushed absently at. Eddie. His voice was tired and small as he looked down at me. No church today? I hadn't been in months and he'd once admitted to envying me. I just didn't see the need any longer, and I've relished the extra hours. I ignored the question. What's troubling you, Carl? Maddie all right? I asked. He turned towards the south, to the storm, and sucked loudly on his lower lip. After a few moments of thought, he sighed deeply, with a phlegmy rumble. The Hattersons are dead, all of them, except Saul, he said evenly, not returning his gaze to mine. I drank this in for a moment, feeling the insides my sinuses beginning to burn in the cold and arid breeze. I briefly dwelt upon the image of the youngest Hatterson, a tow-headed toddler with the dim-looking smile I'd seen at the general store with Saul and Molly a few days prior. How? I asked finally. He grimaced slightly, still gazing south. Saul's missing. No one's seen him since last night. Molly and the kids are dead, and Saul's gone. It don't sound good. Carl slumped forward a little, and I saw, not for the first time, how old he was. The whole hornet's nest is stirred up over in Picton. He was going to lose the farm, they say. Fleetingly, it concerned me that I could easily see the connection between these facts. Maddie's fine, he said after another silent moment. Just a little ill this morning, thanks for asking. He broke from the black clouds and fixed his eyes on me. He offered a pale imitation of his familiar smile, but his eyes remained squinted tight, haunted. He looked as if he had more to say, but at last he just nodded and gathered the reins. Be safe, Eddie, he said, a phrase worn smooth by repeated use, and turned towards his farm, trotting quickly, head still crooked towards the storm. By noon, I could only watch as it reached up and blotted out the sun. The dust storm enveloped us, obscuring the sky like the hands of God. I did my best to ration the allotment of bourbon I'd poured off that morning, watching the black wind scour the earth through a broken shutter slat. During the storms of the years before, pale and weak compared to this tempest, Adele would huddle with the girls to read scripture, inevitably ending with the revelations in hushed, reverent tones. I'd tried not to scowl at her fear and awe before, but now I could feel a little tremor of doubt in me as I looked out at the sackcloth sky. When the sky darkened a few shades at nightfall, I prepared a small meal of bread and fried eggs and drained the rest of the bourbon. Later, I laid in the unmade bed with the world spinning and the sky howling outside and tried not to think. The storm raged stronger than ever the next morning. The sun winking through the maelstrom, a fat circle of hazy orange like a fading coal. Late in the day, it showed no sign of abating, and I resigned to leave the house, if only to feed the animals. I tied my goggles to my head and a damp bandana around my mouth, but I still gasped at the ragged burn of the dust when I stepped outside into the storm. The lining of my throat seemed to crack and bleed within moments. I could barely see the barn, but I set out instinctually towards it. A tall hillock of fine black dust was pressed to the side, and it took me a few kicks to clear the door. The dust had seeped in everywhere, and the hogs and cows were covered in a layer of grime. They stood still in their pens, eyes red and glassy, shuddering and jerking with each loud creak from the roof beams. They ignored the food. There was a twisting coil of anxiety in my chest when Carl arrived, leading the terrified horse behind him. His beard was matted with dust, and he had to sweep the lenses of the googles clean at my doorstep, but instead of entering, he only waved me out to join him. "You need to come with me," he shouted over the storm. The dust between his teeth had formed a thin black mud that flecked at the corners of his mouth. It was his tone, flat and even, that terrified me. I didn't argue, but pulled on goggles and offered him a second bandana. I followed close behind him, one hand on the horse's haunch. Carl picked his way down the path, navigating by some uncanny memory of the curves in the little road. We walked cautiously and deliberately west for the better part of half a mile, past Carl's own farm, towards the leaning shape of the Collins farm. A throbbing dread began to stir in my breast as we approached. The door was thrown wide open, and off one of its hinges swinging violently in the wind. I could see Roger Collins, slumped in the doorframe, the congealing blood on his forehead, caked with the fine dirt. His eyes were open. The left eye beneath the bullet hole was flooded red and tilted wildly skyward. Clutched in his curled hands was a rifle with one spent casing. Abigail Collins and her youngest were inside, curled tightly around each other in the corner of the room. The flowers of blood that bloomed on the fabric of their dresses was bright and vivid. Slumped upright at the dinner table, as if ready for a meal, was another figure, filthy and caked with black dust. He seemed composed, sitting upright and proud, despite the pinprick bullet hole, clean and bloodless, standing starkly in the center of his throat. His grimy skin was dried and shriveled. His eyes were closed, the lids sunken over the pits. It took a long, yawning moment to recognize the desiccated face. Saul Hatterson, hands clasped around a little revolver, looking for all the world like he'd been dead for a week. Saul Hatterson, grinning obscenely wide, showing dried black gums. Despite the roaring storm, there was an unearthly stillness in the little house, and I could hear my heart thudding in my ears. I turned to Carl with pitiful expression, a plea for some sort of understanding. I was bringing them some canned food. Roger was worried about being able to last out a long store, he shouted from the front porch, where he was closing Roger's eyes and wiping the blood from his hand. He looked up at me and stood. "Jed's missing." I gazed around the room again before turning to Carl. "You don't think that, Jed?" I began, letting the idea remain unsaid. Jed was a quiet and sickly kid, but something about him had always set my teeth on edge. "No," he barked. "I don't think a 15-year-old could be capable of this. But I didn't think Saul was either. None of this makes any sense." He brushed the lenses of his goggles clean once more. "No, it does not," I agreed. "We should head into Picton to tell someone, but I need you to drive the Collins Ford. I can make it between our 3 farms on foot reliably enough, but I don't think me or that horse could make it all the way into town." Carl looked mildly embarrassed, hidden as he was behind dust and beard, and I followed him to barn. The Model A made a few grinding rasps before dying completely, refusing to respond to anything. When I opened the gas cap, a damp and clumping mixture of dust and gasoline tumbled from the little opening. My breath came in increasingly shallow gasps as we moved to the Collins tractor, unscrewing the cap. The same reeking clay was stuffed to the top of the tank. The walk back towards our farms was silent, my heart pounding as I struggled to keep my breathing steady, as the inside of my sinuses were scoured raw. First Carl's tractor, then we checked mine. Both were useless and clogged with dust. If Carl was as panicked as I was, he refused to show it. "Eddie, I don't know what this means," he yelled to me as we crouched over my tractor, the sky dimming. "But I think I'd appreciate it if you stayed with me and Maddie tonight. The storm has to let up in the morning, I'm sure." I could see at last the spark of fear in his eyes, and it brought me a little solace. Carl went ahead, panicky with thoughts of Maddie, sick in bed on her own, and I agreed to follow shortly. I entered my house to gather my shotgun and a tin of coffee. I don't believe I intended to start drinking, but the bloody and crooked eye was shining wetly in my memory, and I drew from the bourbon a few soothing pulls. I recall being tired and weary from the day's grim business, but I don't remember lying down on the cool wood of the floor. When I woke gripping the gun and empty bottle, the sky was lighter, but the whirling black clouds still surrounded the world on all sides. Tuesday. I thought through a fog of pain. Or is it Wednesday? I groggily allowed the shame to flood in when I realized I'd left Carl and Maddie waiting all night. After finding all the water drained the night before, I dressed for the storm and headed out to the well. The pump handle strained against me as I pressed downward, bringing up the first sounds of water. What came out of the pump was black and viscous, a thin black paste. I dropped the tin bucket in disgust, feeling yesterday's dread igniting behind the alcohol ache, and I turned quickly towards Carl's farm. On the road, with my destination not yet visible, I turned to see behind me. There wasn't even the faint outline of my barn. In that moment, I was alone, surrounded by a wall of vibrating earth and wind all sides. It could have been all of creation, and I would never know. It could be the end of creation, and I would never know. I turned back towards Carl's farm and began to run in a panic, frantically hoping I had not altered direction. As the small unpainted house came into view, I saw Carl's horse, lying motionless on the ground, still tied to the railing on the porch. A small dune of black dust had formed against one side. The door was wide open, slamming into the wall with a sharp crack at each breath from the storm. My panic spiked like a fever when I stepped inside, and my body began shaking violently. Maddie lay spilled from her bed, trailing sheets and a shredded fragment of her nightgown. Her head was twisted, the neck bruised and bent, and bulging glassy eyes seemed to stare directly at me. Her tongue was thick and black between her teeth. Seated on the bed above her, spindly legs dangling over the edge, was the dried and leathery corpse of Jed Collins, the missing boy. His eye sockets gaped empty and black as he silently grinned out at the world. Carl was nowhere to be found. I backed out quietly from the house, at last truly toning out the chaotic roar of the storm. My mind spun trying to make sense of utter madness, and it stoked the fires inside me. Panting, desperate dread flooding my limbs until I found myself propelled, blind, running through the storm towards my home. I continued past the hulking silhouette of my barn, legs flooding with fire as I sucked in great lungfuls of choking dust. I thought nothing of destination. I only wanted to get as far away from the storm as possible, far from the empty charnel houses of my neighbors and from empty eyes and wicked grins. I made it as far as Thin Fork of the Missouri that carves the far edge of my land. I saw, through the wall of shifting haze, the black outline of the river from a distance. When I approached, legs slowing and lungs burning, I saw the river more clearly, wide and unearthly still. The water was black and thick, and in mute disbelief I watched it flow, slowly like molasses, under a dark and churning sky. And then, I began to understand. I nailed the shutters closed, driven by an animal urgency of purpose. The door I braced with Adele's heirloom cabinet, allowing it to crack and splinter on its side as I stacked a steamer chest on top. I didn't really believe that this would slow whatever would come tonight, in the howling darkness, but I wanted to have the time to know, to be sure. The last bourbon bottle lay empty on the floor, and I was glad for this, for the chance to be clear-headed at last. I sat, back to the wall, facing the door with the shotgun in my hands, and I waited. The sky darkened, and the storm continued to howl. I measured my breaths, trying to hold on to that moment of calm, to stretch it out until it dried and snapped apart. It was late at night when it arrived. I could hear the heavy footsteps circling the porch, pulling lightly, testing each shutter. My hands were suddenly slick with sweat on the barrel of the shotgun. The shuffling footsteps stopped in front of door, and I saw the wood flex ever so slightly as pressure was applied. A scraping sound began to rise, hissing, from the small barricade as it began to slide slowly across the floor. The force on the other side of the door increased slowly, steadily, grinding against the heavy barricade until the door was open to the storm and to the night and beyond. The figure swept into the room with a silent grace that surprised me and stood regarding me. Carl's skin seemed to crackle and go taut like paper as he moved, and in the hollow of his empty eyes were tiny twisting clouds of dust, blue ribbons of electricity arcing across the sockets. He was smiling, a smile I'd never seen from him, a wide, obscene grin. I felt a strange sort of calm then, the surety of knowing, despite the impossible madness of it all. I raised the shotgun. "Eddie," the thing inside Carl hissed in a voice like grinding sand. The corpse took another step towards me, and I saw a black trickle of mud from the edge of its cracked lips. "Go ahead and shoot, Eddie. See what it gets you." I smiled back at him, seeing the solution so clearly at last. I took a moment to be thankful that Adele and the girls are gone. Thankful, in an awful way, that I'd struck her, hard enough for her to finally leave me. This would not be the night that they die. It had moved halfway across the room now, shuffling towards me, the malevolent sparks of its eyes locked on me. The now familiar dread reared up to swallow my temporary peace. I saw, in the black whirlpool of its eyes, the great storm, covering the entire earth in a final gloom. I saw trails and chains of endless murder and atrocity crisscrossing the darkened world, into that last eternal night. I saw the end. All I had left was a little sliver of hope, enough to spur me onward. I swung the shotgun up under my chin, feeling the cool of the barrel on my chin. The thing inside Carl jerked to a halt and ceased to smile, and I knew I'd gambled right this time. It needed me, and it can't have me. I made sure I was smiling, drinking in the thing's rage and frustration. The thing roared, and with a leap, burst from Carl's body, his drying muscles snapping and shredding into long fraying fibers, as it shed him like a coat, thudding to the floor behind. It was a swirling cloud, a flurry of dust, coursing with lightning and pure elemental hatred that I saw then, surging towards me faster than I would have believed possible. Thin tendrils coiled and tightened and wound their way through air, twisting towards my mouth and nose. I could feel them caress the raw passages of my lungs, hot, twisting, and unmistakably, horribly, alive as they slid into me. I pulled the trigger. Credit, Joseph K. Cameron Suey. The anniversary of Lane's death wasn't for another 3 days, but when Cochise came on the radio as I approached that curve, I took it as a sign. Lane's favorite song. I pressed the gas and shifted gears as Chris Cornell began to wail. The needle on the odometer crept up. The yellow posted warning sign screamed at me, but still I accelerated. The night Lane died, the cops estimated that his friend Jimmy had tried to take this curve doing. Fucking Jimmy, the weird little stoner kid from down the street. I hated him, hated his faux hippie parents who changed the flowers around the roadside crosses with the seasons. Like Jimmy and Lane and those other kids gave a damn if it was Christmas or Easter anymore. But the Hendricks did it anyway. Now the crosses were decorated with bright orange leaves for fall. I saw them appear just as I entered the curve, doing 67 miles per hour. The rear of my beat-up Civic began to slip, but I gripped the wheel and held onto it, taking the outside. I kept my gaze focused ahead of the slide, knowing better than to fix on stationary objects. Too late to hit the brakes. Instead, I eased off the gas and turned into the spin at the apex of the turn. My car gave a shimmy and a weird bobble. For one heart-stopping moment, I thought this would be the one that got me. But the Civic held on, even on tires that desperately needed replacing. When I accelerated at the end of the turn and whipped onto the straightaway again, I released the breath I was holding and pulled to the side of the road. I walked back to the place where the 4 white crosses waited and stared at the name on the first one. Then I ripped the leaves from it. Jimi Hendrix. They hadn't even spelled his name right. They hadn't taught him how to spell his name, and they hadn't taught him how to take a curve. I walked behind the crosses and lay on the ground beside a scarred oak tree, in the same spot that had once soaked up my brother's blood. I stared up at the September sky and said, "You left me all alone." The night of the accident, my mother had called to say she'd be working late. Although I was only 14 months older than Lane, my mother had always left me in charge. As soon as I'd told Lane, he'd started pestering me to go to the movies with Jimmy. I usually let him do what he wanted, because Lane could talk the birds from the skies. But my mother's new boyfriend made me uncomfortable. He stood too close, stared too long. I'd cast a nervous glance at the living room. "Hey," Lane said, "go to Sherry's till 9. I swear I'll be home by then. I won't leave you alone with him." I had nodded, and he'd grinned. I hadn't smiled back. He'd made me look at him. I promise, Dad, and I promise you, I'll always protect you. I swear on my soul, I'll never leave you and I'll always have your back. So, 9 o'clock. Okay? But that was a promise he hadn't been able to keep. When I'd rounded that curve 9:15 that night, the EMTs were frantically working to save Lane and one of the other boys. I'd thought maybe they'd known Lane wouldn't make it to the hospital because they'd let me have a few precious seconds by his side. His green eyes had been dazed, unfocused. I'd clutched his bloody hand and screamed his name. He'd made a gurgling sound and turned his face toward me. Hold on, I'd begged. Don't you leave me. You promised you'd never leave me. He'd squeezed my hand and then they'd pulled me away. He'd died before they reached the hospital. If Lane had been driving, would he have made the curve? I thought the handling on the Hendrix's Accord and my Civic probably wouldn't have been that much different. And Lane had even more experience than I had on the dirt bike track. Unlike me, he hadn't quit when our father died. But that was just one more what if in a towering pile of what ifs that loomed high in the sky and meant nothing at all. I pulled into my childhood driveway a few minutes later and sighed. Visits with my mother, never pleasant, grew excruciating around the anniversary of Lane's death. It hurt to see what this place had become, what my mother had become. Flower beds so meticulously tended when my father was alive were strangled out by weeds, framing a sagging, peeling white house with missing shingles. A rusted swing set still lingered beside the house, unused for over a decade, and the outside of this place wasn't half as desperate as the inside. I put the car in park, stepped out and adjusted the short skirt that was part of my work uniform before kicking a beer can and scowling at the tall grass. I barged in without knocking and followed the sound of the blaring television to the living room, where my mother's boyfriend predictably occupied my father's old recliner. I kicked a pizza box and flinched when a cockroach skittered away from my gleaming black heels. "Where's Mom?" I asked, and Darius turned his bloodshot eyes on me. He leered, his eyes traveling slowly up my body then down again. "Is that any way to greet me?" "Oh, my bad." "Hey, Darius, you fucking pervert, where is my mother?" He laughed and stood, lurching on his feet. For a moment I felt the same panic I had at 15, but my fingers fumbled in my pocket and closed around the knife I kept there. I forced myself to remain calm. I wasn't a helpless teenager anymore. "She's at the cemetery," Darius said, then licked his lips. "We've got time to have a nice little visit. Come say hi to Daddy." "Stay away from me," I said. "You got all this time, why don't you go mow the fucking yard? Seems like the least you could do, since my mother pays all your bills." His eyes hardened. "Don't talk like that to me, you little whore." Moving faster than I anticipated he could, he lunged at me. My head cracked against the drywall and he seized my chin, forcing me to look up at him. His breath smelled like beer and garlic, and I gagged. "I hear you put out for everybody that comes through. That bar where you work, I'm getting jealous." He pressed his filthy, stinking body against mine and tried to push up my skirt, but the knife was already in my hand. His eyes widened when he heard the click of the switchblade. I was sure Darius had been in enough barroom brawls to know what that sound meant. I pressed it against his crotch. "That's not big enough to kill me," he hissed. "And if you ever cut me, you'd better fucking kill me." I smiled. "It's big enough to get rid of some unsightly bulges. I keep her sharp." He released my chin and held up his hands. I let him back away. "Tell your mother if she ain't back by dark, I'm locking her out." "This isn't your house," I snapped. He shot me a baleful look, then slumped back to the recliner. I gulped a breath of fresh air when I stepped outside. I'd left this place as soon as I'd graduated high school, and if not for the obligation I felt for my mother, I would never come back at all. The cemetery was visible from the driveway, just over the hillside, but I chose to drive. I could guess what shape my mother was in. I found Mama sprawled on the ground between my father's and Lane's graves, a half-empty bottle of Jack in her hands. Once Bella had been beautiful, as her name suggested, but those days were long gone. Her face was ravaged by alcohol, drugs, and grief. She looked up with bleary red eyes. "It's time to go, Mama," I said, and reached for her arm. She jerked away. "I'm not ready to go yet. It's getting dark and I need to get to work." "Go then," she muttered. "I need to make sure you're home and that you have your medicine. You want it, right?" Of course she did. Mama liked her medicine almost as much as her alcohol. After a near overdose last month, I had taken her pills and dispensed them to her on a weekly basis. It really needed to be on a daily basis. But I couldn't stand the thought of making this trip every day. I suspected Mama went through a week's supply in a couple of days, but was also pretty sure it would take more than that to kill her. Mama allowed me to help her up. She kissed her fingertips and placed them first on my father's tombstone, then on Lane's. "It was your fault," she told me. I wrapped my arm around my mother's waist, taking on most of the small woman's weight. I'd heard comments like that so many times they barely stung anymore. I figured Lane was better off wherever he was because surely this was hell. I was almost jealous of him. I didn't put much stock in the afterlife, and the thought of just nothingness sounded pretty damn good to me. We didn't talk on the way back to my mother's house. No use telling her about Darius. Mama hadn't cared when I told her about him 7 years ago, and she wouldn't care now. Another wound that barely stung anymore. I helped her to the front door, gave her the little box labeled with the days of the week, and left. All this crap had taken longer than anticipated, and I was nearly 10 minutes late when I pulled up to Charlie's bar. Half the sign had shorted out, so it simply read Char Bar, which was an apt name for anything that came out of that kitchen. That's what the locals called it. Charlie hated it, so I called it that too. I straightened my skirt, flipped and tousled my hair, then undid an extra couple of buttons on my shirt. I was a damn good waitress, but I wasn't naive enough to think that's why I got the best tips. When you leave home at 17, you learn to play the game to survive. Brody looked up from the bar when I walked in and gave me one of his perfect, dazzling smiles. He was a college kid making a little extra cash while he finished up the school year. Maybe not as spoiled as most of the ones who came through. He actually worked, but a rich boy just the same. He'd be gone before the ink dried on his diploma. The bar was a weird mix of college kids, locals, and stragglers off interstate. They segregated themselves in odd little clumps. I edged past a rowdy group of bikers and headed toward the bar. Brody placed a bag of lemons on the bar and said loudly, "Thanks for picking these up. Sorry I made you late." "No problem," I said, taking his cue. Charlie came around the corner. He looked at me, the bag of lemons, and finally Brody. "Tell Jacobs if he can't get the order right, I'll take my business elsewhere." Brody tapped a salute off his forehead, and Charlie frowned, but he disappeared back to the kitchen without another word. "Thanks," I said, and he smiled again. He really was handsome. I liked the way his blue eyes crinkled in the corners when he grinned. But we were so different, I wasn't even sure if we'd count as the same species. "You've got even tables." I already did their drinks. 2 and 8 have ordered. 6 was still looking at the menu. He was always helping me. Every shift, he stayed late to help me roll silverware and refill ketchup bottles, though that was not part of his duties. I'd never admit it, but sometimes the most fun I had all day was when we were cleaning up. He'd put some stupid song on the jukebox and sing to me. Sometimes we'd dance, even though he probably just wanted what every other guy who tried to talk to me wanted. At least he was nice about it, unlike the biker at table 3, who was yelling to get my attention. "Hey Blondie," he shouted. "Get that sweet ass over here and take my order. I'm thirsty." Christy, the other waitress on shift that night, stood helplessly by, trying to take his order, but the biker would have none of it. I motioned her forward. "Take my 6, I said. "I'll handle it." Looking relieved, Christy scurried away. I pasted on a smile and sauntered over to the table. I spoke to the one making all the noise, a muscular dark-haired man with a snake tattoo that started at his neck and ended with rattles down his middle finger. "What can I get you?" He leaned back in his chair and gave me an appreciative smile, fishing his wallet from his pocket by the chain attached to his belt. Loop, he withdrew 2 $100 bills and placed them beneath the salt shaker. "2 buckets of Bud to start. One of these is for the tab, one is for you if you don't let us run dry till that 100 is gone. Understand, sweet thing?" "Sure thing, honey," I drawled, and his grin widened. As I walked away, I heard him tell his buddies, "Tell me that ain't the best ass in Tennessee." I rolled my eyes and made a face at Brody, who stood tense at the bar, watching the exchange. 2 buckets of Budweiser, I said. "Avery, that's not your table. You don't have to serve those guys. I can take care of myself, Brody." He frowned, but turned to fix the buckets without another word. Sweet of him to worry, but unnecessary. Plus, that tip would be great, considering rent was due this week. I might actually be able to eat something that didn't come from the char bar. When I returned to the table, I noticed a cell number scrawled on one of the bills. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes again and instead engaged in some banter with them. When I walked away, Rattlesnake slapped my ass. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Brody start to come around the bar, and I hurried to head him off. I said, "I can take care of myself," I hissed. "Do not go over there." His blue eyes flashed. "Avery, you're not a piece of meat. He has no right to touch you." "I don't mind." He scowled and threw a dish towel behind the bar. "Maybe you should. Yeah, maybe I should. Maybe I should do a lot of things. But these days, It was hard to feel much of anything. Finally, the bikers left and the crowd thinned. After I took table 4 their check, I stepped outside to smoke. When I heard the back door creak open a moment later, I flicked my ashes and said, "If I just fuck you, will you stop following me around like some little damn dog?" Brody sighed, leaned back against the wall, and squinted at me. I clutched the shoulders of the man who labored over me. His snake tattoo looked even more sinister, covered in a fine sheen of sweat. But I wasn't thinking about that, wasn't even thinking about him. Sex was just a release for me. There were never any feelings attached. Maybe that was why Brody's words troubled me so much. I closed my eyes, remembering what he'd said. "Geez, Avery, why are you such a hard ass? Maybe I just care about you." I snorted. "You don't know anything about me." "I want to," he said. "One chance. Let me take you out on a date." A date. I nearly snorted again. I hadn't been on a real date since high school. One night stands with strangers hardly counted. Brody had no idea. "Why would you want to date me?" I demanded. He gave me that crooked grin and shrugged. "I don't know, because sometimes you forget to be an asshole?" I laughed in spite of myself. "I think you're afraid of me," he said. "I think you know I'd be good to you, and you don't know how to handle that." "I'm not relationship material," I said, and took another drag of my cigarette. "You could be, with me." I stubbed my cigarette out and gave him a patient smile. "You think we're alike. We're not." I pointed through the window at a group of roughnecks. "I'm like them, white trash, going nowhere." Then I pointed at a group of giggling college girls waiting around the bar for Brody's return. "You're one of them. You'll leave here after you graduate, marry a girl like that, named Mallory or Ashley or Tiffany, and forget about this little dive bar you worked in during college. You'll forget about me. I don't mean anything to anyone." "You're wrong," he said. "You mean something to me." The biker collapsed on top of me and I sighed, glad he was finally finished. I'd hoped he could take my mind off things, but now I regretted even coming to his motel room. He rolled onto his back, and I lay there, thinking, waiting until I thought he'd dozed off. Then I eased away from him and fumbled for my clothes in the dark. His hand shot out and grabbed me, pulling me back. "Where you think you're going?" he asked, slurring. "I need to get home," I said and tried to pull away. "Aw, no," he said. "We ain't finished yet, darlin'. Just taking a breather." "I'm finished," I said. "Let me up." In the dark, I didn't see the fist swinging around at me. He clocked me in the side of the face and I fell back, stunned. His hands closed around my throat and I kicked and flailed at him. But he was so strong. My last thought before I lost consciousness wasn't of Lane, but of Brody. Of how disappointed he'd be when they found my naked, battered body in some cheap motel tomorrow. I'd tried to tell him. I was no good. Guess he'd finally see that. I woke up on my stomach, my cheek pressed against stiff white sheets. It took me a moment to remember where I was, but I was smart enough not to move until I got my bearings. I hurt all over, especially my throat. What had he done to me? I needed to cough. My throat burned, tickled. My eyes watered, and I didn't know how long I'd be able to suppress it. I heard his labored breathing beside me. Sounded like he was out, but I didn't dare turn my head. Instead, I strained to see in the dim room, looking for a weapon. He'd left the bathroom light on. I saw the contents of my purse strewn across the worn carpet. My wallet gaped open. Empty. Motherfucker. I gritted my teeth and made a push toward the edge of the bed. I paused, but detected no change in his breathing. I forced myself up on shaky legs and fumbled on my clothes. Stuffing my things back into my purse, I realized my money wasn't the only thing missing. So was my knife. The smart thing would have been to slip out the door and run, but I needed my money. Not just the tip, but the other he'd taken from my wallet. I crept to his side of the bed and unplugged the lamp. When I tried to lift it, I found it was bolted to the table, so I unplugged the phone instead. Then I searched until I found his wallet. I thought about just taking my part of the money, but I thought, fuck it, and took it all, my money, plus 200 or so. He began to stir. I gripped the phone and crashed it down on his head. He cursed and I hit him again. Then I ran. The morning sunlight nearly blinded me, and for one terrifying moment, I couldn't find my keys. "Please, please, please," I gasped, fumbling in my purse. There they were. I jumped in my car, still watching the motel door, but it never opened. I didn't kill him, I thought. Surely I didn't kill him. I was nearly a mile away when I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Blood spattered my face. I hadn't even felt it. "Oh God," I said, and fumbled in my glove compartment for napkins. 20 minutes later, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, trying to figure out what to do. Ugly red bruises stood out against the pale skin of my throat. Even the whites of my eyes were red. Maybe I should go to the police. It was self-defense, right? I decided to drive back to the motel. To my relief, his bike was gone when I got there. For 2 days, I never left my apartment. The next night, however, I had to work. I almost called in. This was the anniversary of Lane's death. I might not make it until tomorrow anyway. But with my luck, I'd probably survive. Again. I tried to cover up the bruises with makeup, but that somehow made them look worse. I washed it off, then tied a scarf around my neck. It looked dumb, but I couldn't think of anything else. At least my red eyes had cleared up. Brody gave me a long look when I walked into the bar. Change of shift was busy, and I managed to avoid him until my first smoke break. He followed me outside. "That biker guy's been looking for you," he said. "Oh?" I said, and he frowned at the rasp in my voice. "I told him you'd quit. When he came back the next night, I told him you'd still quit." Charlie backed me up. He looked pretty rough. Not as rough as you, though. Before I knew it, he pushed me against the wall and reached for the scarf. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to force his hands away. I haven't seen anyone wear an ascot since Fred on Scooby-Doo. The scarf came free in his hands. "Jesus, Avery," he said, and I felt absurdly near tears at the horror in his eyes. When I didn't speak, he said, "That guy said you took his money. What are you into, Avery? Is it drugs?" He looked away. "Prostitution?" A tear slid down my cheek. "Is that what you think of me?" I shook my head and pushed past him. He tried to grab my arm, but I jerked away. I walked through that back door, through that restaurant, and out the front. I heard Brody call my name, but I never slowed down. Maybe fate would be kind tonight. I wanted to die. More than anything. I kept picturing the look on Brody's face. He was the only one who'd believed in me, the closest thing I had to a friend. Now he thought I was some sort of crack whore. By the time I hit the curve I was doing, when the rear end came around and I started to spin, I closed my eyes and pictured Lane's face. Suddenly his voice filled my head, shouting instructions, as clear as if he were in the seat beside me. When I opened my eyes again, my car was sitting neatly on the side of the road, just past the white crosses. I opened my door and nearly fell out onto the shoulder. I half stumbled, half crawled over to the memorial and collapsed in front of Lane's cross, sobbing. "Avery, Avery, are you okay?" I rolled onto my back and tried to scramble away. Brody fell to his knees beside me and reached for me. "Hey, it's me!" I slapped his hands. "What are you doing here? Why are you following me? What just happened?" He looked at the crosses. His gaze lingered on Lane's. "What is this place?" "My brother died here." I never talked about my personal life, ever. But once I started talking, I couldn't stop. I told Brody everything. About Lane, about Darius, my mother. Even about Rattlesnake Guy. When I finally stopped, I was afraid to look at him. Now he would know I was trash. Just like I'd tried to tell him. He wrapped his arms around me. I froze for a moment, then sagged against him. His arms tightened around me. "What happened to Lane was not your fault. Why would you think that? I was the oldest. I was in charge. We were supposed to stay home. You were kids, Avery. This wasn't anyone's fault." He paused. "What I just saw with the curve, you do that every year?" I didn't answer. He kissed the top of my head. "You are the strongest person I've ever known." I gave a strangled laugh. "I'm weak. When I went into that curve tonight, I wanted to die. I'm so alone, Brody." He gave me a fierce hug. "You are not alone. Not anymore. Let's get out of here, okay? We're going back to my place." I wasn't sure what showed on my face, but he shook his head. "Not for that. I'm not letting you stay alone tonight." He stood and reached to help me up. I took his hand. He smiled and hauled me to my feet. I brushed a kiss on my fingertips and pressed it to Lane's cross, then slid under the arm Brody offered. His place wasn't much bigger than mine, though his furniture was better. I'd muddied my clothes, so he found me one of his shirts and a pair of drawstring shorts to put on. We talked for hours, about my family, about his. I learned that money didn't necessarily buy a happy childhood. Even when there was nothing left to say, I felt comfortable, safe. I hadn't felt that in years. I fell asleep with my head on his shoulder. I woke sometime later, lying on the couch. Brody lay beside me, spooning my back, his arms around me. When I stirred, he mumbled, "Don't go." Lying there, wrapped in the heat of his body, breathing in his scent, I didn't want to go. I twisted around and kissed him. He kissed me back, rolling on top of me. But when I reached to tug his shirt over his head, he stopped me. "Avery, please," I said. I want this. He led me to his bedroom. That night, I broke one of my rules. He didn't leave. I woke the next morning and reached for him. His side of the bed was empty. I snagged a t-shirt off the floor and went to search for him. I found him in front of the stove, singing and dancing in his boxers, making breakfast. I pressed my fingertips to my lips, but failed to suppress my smile. Apparently, he didn't hear my approach. I witnessed a rather inspired performance of Prince's song, Kiss. I laughed, feeling happy for the first time in a long time. He whirled but didn't seem embarrassed. He placed a plate of pancakes on the table and seized me, dancing me around his tiny kitchen. "Good morning, beautiful," he said. "Good morning." I glanced at the plates of food covering the kitchen table and raised an eyebrow. "You having company over?" Ha! Ha! Sunlight streaming through his kitchen window made his eyes look blue and bright as a June sky. "Baby, I am hungry." He winked at me and said, "And maybe I wanted to impress you a little." I grinned and draped my arms around his neck. "Oh, I'm impressed. Mostly that you have this much food in your house, considering we both work at the same place." I winced. "Well, maybe we used to. I guess maybe we're fired." "I took care of it. I talked to Charlie, told him you had an emergency, and it's all good. We have tonight off too." "What?" I gasped. "Charlie hates me." "No, he doesn't. You never miss work. Besides, how would he replace both of us?" "You're amazing," he smiled. "So, since we have tonight off, how about that date?" "Date? You know, dinner, dancing, something besides burned corn dogs, and dancing around the jukebox at Char Bar." "But that's my favorite." "I know. I may have set the bar too high, but I'll do my best to impress you." "You already impress me." And he did. Brody was a nice guy, a good man. When I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks later, he didn't say, "Are you going to keep it, or is it mine?" He said, "Marry me." "Brody, I don't know if it's yours. I won't put this on you if it's not yours." "I don't care if it is. It will be. We will never know any differently, and the baby won't either. I love you, Avery. We can be the parents we always needed. Marry me." But I couldn't, not without knowing. I talked to my doctor and he scheduled an amniocentesis when I was far enough along. The day we met the doctor to discuss the results, I was a wreck. I'd given up cigarettes the day I learned I was pregnant, and my nerves were shot. I'd been unable to sleep that night. And while staring into Brody's face in the moonlight, I'd made a decision. If the baby was his, I'd marry him, and I'd do my damnedest to be a good wife and mother. If it wasn't, I'd leave in the middle of the night and never look back. I was not going to tie him to another man's child. Brody tried to make small talk while we waited, but I couldn't hold up my end. Both me and my baby had so much to lose. I wanted Brody to be the father so badly, not for his money or even his support. One day, this child would want to know about its father. I did not want to have to tell it that I didn't even know his name. The doctor looked at Brody and held out his hand. "Congratulations, Dad." Brody's grin lit up that office. He pumped the doctor's hand and then turned to hug me. So I agreed to marry him. On our wedding day, Brody punched his best friend in the face for telling him he couldn't turn a whore into a housewife. Maybe he was right. I didn't know. All I knew was that I would do my best not to let him down, not to let either of them down. I didn't know if I was capable of love, but the day I looked into Brody's shining eyes over that surgical mask when he held our son for the first time, I knew I loved them both. I couldn't say it, however, but I hoped he knew. He stood by my side when I cut ties with my mother. My son was my priority now. I could no longer try to help someone who wasn't interested in helping herself. I also would never have my child around Darius. Lucas was a difficult baby. Brody and I learned how to live on little sleep. A colicky infant stage progressed to night terrors by age 3. That was the age he began to talk a lot more. And also when I started to suspect there was something terribly wrong with my son. One night, as he played with one of his toy cars, he looked at Brody and said, "His name is Dale." Brody glanced at the black car with the number 3 on the door and looked at Lucas in surprise. "Yeah, that's Dale Earnhardt's car. How did you know that?" Lucas shrugged and said, "My other dad told me." Brody stared at me. "Other dad?" I shrugged, but I saw the tension in his face. "Who's your other dad, Lucas?" he asked. Lucas wouldn't answer. "Can I see you in the kitchen?" I asked. "You can't turn a whore into a housewife, right?" I said when we were out of Lucas's earshot. He reached for me and I jerked away. "I've never cheated on you. I've never even considered it. I care about you." Brody sighed. "I know you do. I'm sorry. It just caught me off guard, I guess." He pulled me to him and this time I didn't fight it. "I love you, Avery, and I know you love me too. I only wish you could say it." I did too. There was this feeling that if I did, something horrible would happen. One night, while Brody lay across my lap, I traced the words on his back with my fingertips. I thought he was sleeping, but he kissed my thigh and said, "I love you too." My mother called me a week before the 10th anniversary of Lane's death, begging to see Lucas. She told me she'd been clean for 2 years and that she'd kicked Darius out the same day I had told her goodbye. I told her I'd think about it and disconnected the call. That night, I pulled down an old photo album from the closet. I'd stolen it from my mother's house before I moved out. Lucas climbed into my lap and Brody looked over my shoulder while I flipped through it. Lucas pointed at a picture of a year-old Lane and said, "That's me." "No, honey, that's your Uncle Lane. He's in heaven now." Lucas ignored me, poring over the pictures with an intensity rarely seen in the rambunctious toddler. He pointed at another picture. "That's my old dad." "That's my dad," I said. He looked at me with his bright blue eyes and said, "I know, Mommy." That week, Brody called me from a restaurant parking lot. I heard Lucas in the background, having a meltdown. They'd been fishing and stopped to get lunch. "Hey, honey," Brody said, "do you want us to bring you something?" "I'm good." "Why's he crying?" "You'll never believe it. He's crying because the waitress took away his corn cob." "His what?" "A corn cob. He started screaming that he wanted me to make him a pizza pie or something, like his old dad did." Lucas screamed in the background, "Peace pie, peace pie." "Do you have any idea what he's talking about, babe?" "No, none." But something was there. Some memory tugged at the back of my mind. Brody sighed. "Okay, well, we'll be home in about an hour. I love you." He hung up instead of waiting on the reply he knew wasn't coming. I stared at my phone, then impulsively called my mother. "Mom, I have a weird question. About Lane." "Okay," my mother said slowly. "Did Dad ever make something for him out of corn cobs?" "Yeah. He made these pipes, out of dried out corn cobs and sticks. Lane thought he was big stuff, clamping it between his teeth and walking around like Popeye." "I don't remember that." "Well, you were a girl. Your father didn't believe in little girls even pretend smoking. Did he call them something?" "He called them peace pipes. He'd grab his cigarettes, hand Lane his pipe and say, 'Come on, son, let's go smoke our peace pipes.'" "Why do you ask?" This was not something I wanted to run by my mother. An old memory, I guess. They made small talk. My mother told me about the latest sobriety coin she'd earned and said, "Avery, I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I didn't believe you about Darius. Mom, I have to go," I said. "I'll call you later." Some things I wasn't ready to forgive, or even talk about. Rummaging through the freezer, I took an ear of corn from a freezer bag and boiled it. Then I shaved the corn from it with a knife and placed the cob on the back porch to dry. I made a pipe and sat it on the entertainment center. Lucas didn't notice it until that afternoon after supper. He yelled, peace pie," until Brody followed his gaze and got it down. He shot me a questioning look, then handed it to Lucas. Lucas stuck the end of it in his mouth and beamed at them. That night after I put him to bed, Brody and I discussed it. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I know it's odd, but you don't really think." "I don't know," I admitted. "But he says such strange things sometimes."